The office was quiet. The hum of computers, the soft shuffle of papers, and the occasional murmur of conversations in the distance made it almost peaceful. But for David, it had always been more than just an office. It was a cage, one he couldn't escape from, yet couldn't bring himself to leave. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting a sterile glow over the endless rows of cubicles. His desk was in the far corner, hidden behind a wall of files and monitors, but it was his little sanctuary. It had been a year since he started working at FinTech Solutions, and in that year, he had grown accustomed to being unnoticed. David was a junior analyst, a position that most would consider beneath them, but he didn't mind. He had always been the type of person who liked to observe rather than speak. He was good at his job, excellent, even, but that didn't matter. In the grand hierarchy of the company, his value was overlooked, easily forgotten in the shadows of the louder, more aggressive colleagues. But there was one person in the office who stood out above all the rest: Jason Malone. Jason was the senior project manager, charismatic and ambitious, with a knack for taking credit where it wasn't due. David had noticed this pattern from the moment he first stepped into the office. Jason wasn't just good at his job, he was good at making sure everyone knew how good he was. He had a way with words, a way of convincing upper management that every idea, every innovation, every success was his. And as the months passed, David began to realize just how far Jason's reach extended. It wasn't just the ideas he was taking credit for, it was the money. Jason had built a reputation within the company for being a rainmaker, someone who brought in the big deals and made things happen. But David had started to notice inconsistencies, small, subtle signs that things weren't as they seemed. Invoices didn't quite match the contracts. Bonuses that were awarded didn't line up with the work done. Expenses that were approved without proper documentation. At first, David dismissed it. People made mistakes all the time. But then, as the weeks wore on, the pattern became undeniable. It was Jason. Everything pointed to him. He was the one signing off on the questionable expenses, approving payments that didn't make sense, and making deals that were borderline unethical. The company had always prided itself on transparency and integrity, but David knew that Jason had found a way to exploit the system. The thought nagged at him, gnawing away like a persistent itch he couldn't scratch. The more David saw, the more he understood that the entire operation was built on a house of cards. A few more missteps, a few more wrong decisions, and the whole thing would collapse. The question was, how could he prove it? How could he expose Jason without becoming a target himself? He was just one small part of a much larger machine, and taking down someone like Jason seemed impossible. But David wasn't someone who backed down from a challenge. He wasn't going to let Jason's charm and smooth-talking ways destroy the company that he had worked so hard to build. But there was no point in going to HR or the board or anyone who might listen. Not yet. Not until he had all the pieces. David did confront Jason directly. Instead, he became a quiet observer. Every transaction, every email, every approval was a potential clue. He started documenting everything. It wasn't as easy as it seemed. Jason's schemes were carefully hidden beneath layers of plausible deniability, but David had a talent for finding patterns he always had. It was what made him so good at his job. Where others saw a collection of disconnected numbers, David saw the hidden story they told. It started with a single invoice that didn't add up, a payment made to a vendor that wasn't on the approved list. David's heart had skipped a beat when he saw it. He had run the numbers several times, but the result was the same. Money had been funneled to a company that didn't exist. Jason had approved the payment, of course, and when David asked about it, he had received the usual dismissive response. "It's a simple mistake," Jason had said with a wave of his hand. "Don't worry about it." But David had worried. He worried because this wasn't just one mistake. It was the beginning of something much bigger. The more he looked, the more he found. Small discrepancies, financial statements that didn't match up, vendor invoices that were adjusted without explanation, payments to offshore accounts. Jason had set up a network of financial maneuvers so intricate that it would take a trained eye to see it. And David had the training. He had the patience. And most importantly, he had the determination. For weeks, David quietly collected evidence. He didn't make a sound, didn't ask questions, didn't raise any suspicions. He was just another quiet employee doing his job. But every day, he grew closer to the truth. It was only a matter of time before everything would be revealed. It was late one Thursday evening when the breakthrough came. David had stayed behind after everyone else had left. The office was empty, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the occasional clicking of keyboards as the last few workers wrapped up their tasks. David had been going over the financial logs for the last few hours, cross-referencing them with Jason's approval records. Something didn't feel right. And then, as he dug deeper, he found it. A series of payments had been made to an account that Jason had access to, but it wasn't listed in any of the official records. The name of the account wasn't familiar. He had never seen it before. But David recognized the pattern. It was the same account that had received money from the fake vendor months earlier. His heart raced as he pieced everything together. Jason had been embezzling money from the company, funneling it through a shell corporation, and hiding the evidence with fake invoices and doctored records. But now, with this new information, David had everything he needed. He had the proof, and he wasn't going to let Jason get away with it. But he knew better than to act impulsively. Exposing Jason too soon could cost him everything. He had to wait for the right moment, the right person, the right question. And when the time came, he would be ready. Until then, David would stay silent. He would continue to watch, to listen, and to gather the evidence that would bring Jason down. The following Monday, the office buzzed with the usual morning energy. People were talking about their weekends, catching up on emails, and preparing for the weekly meeting. Jason was in his usual spot, confidently making small talk with the higher-ups, laughing with colleagues, and giving the impression that everything was running smoothly. But David knew better. He knew that the walls were slowly closing in on Jason. And it was only a matter of time before everything would come crashing down. He went about his day as usual, taking care of his work, not drawing attention to himself. But inside, a storm was brewing. Jason had no idea what was coming, and when the moment finally arrived, it would be too late for him to stop it. David had learned over the years that silence was powerful. It was a tool, a weapon even when wielded with precision. Most people thought that silence was a sign of weakness or fear, but for David, it was the opposite. It was the calm before the storm, the steady hand before the strike. He wasn't in a rush. He didn't need to be. The evidence was there, and in time, the right people would ask the right questions. He just had to wait for the right moment. The days after he uncovered Jason's financial schemes felt surreal. It wasn't that David was surprised. He had suspected something was off for months. But now that he had concrete proof, it was like the pieces of a puzzle had clicked into place. He couldn't help but think about how effortlessly Jason had gotten away with it all. How many people had Jason duped over the years with his charm, his flashy presentations, his smooth talk? How many had trusted him because they didn't question his polished exterior? But David had always seen through that. Jason's confidence was a facade, and David knew it. Now, he was just waiting for the right moment to bring it all down. It was Thursday afternoon when the first crack appeared. The email from HR popped up in David's inbox like an unassuming notification. The subject line was simple: workforce review scheduled. It wasn't unusual for HR to conduct reviews, but something about this one felt different. It wasn't just a generic message about an upcoming performance review. It was a meeting specifically scheduled with no agenda. It had been sent by someone in upper management, not just HR. David's pulse quickened as he read through the message. He wasn't included in the initial list of attendees, but that wasn't surprising. He had learned early on that being left out of meetings meant you weren't a threat. And right now, he was. He wasn't even a blip on Jason's radar. But David knew better than to think he was safe. The system was about to start turning. The gears that had been slowly grinding would now be in motion. It was only a matter of time before someone noticed what had been hidden for so long. It wasn't going to be a loud confrontation. It wasn't going to be a scene. This was going to be methodical, like everything else David had done. He would stay in the background, continue doing his job, and let the truth slowly unravel. He wasn't the one who needed to take the first step. He just needed to be there when it happened. The next day, David was called into a meeting with the head of compliance, Laura Bishop. David hadn't spoken to her much before, but he knew of her reputation. Laura was known for being thorough and no-nonsense. She didn't mince words, and she didn't tolerate mistakes. If she was calling David in for a meeting, it meant one thing. Someone had finally started asking questions. "David," Laura began when he walked into her office. "I've been reviewing some of the financial reports for the last quarter. There are some discrepancies I'd like you to clarify." David kept his expression neutral, but his mind was racing. The time had come. Laura had been handed the first piece of the puzzle, and she was already on the right track. But she didn't know everything yet. She only knew what David had chosen to show her. And now, it was time to give her the next clue. "Of course," David replied calmly, sitting down across from her. "What discrepancies are you referring to?" Laura pushed a file across the desk toward him, the same file David had meticulously prepared for just this moment. It contained the records of the fraudulent transactions, the shell company payments, the missing documentation, all the things David had quietly collected over the last few weeks. The evidence was clear and irrefutable. "I've noticed some irregularities in the payment approvals, especially in the last few months. Some payments don't match up with the contracts. Others appear to have been processed outside of the usual channels. I'd like you to explain what happened," Laura said, her tone professional but serious. David didn't flinch. He had anticipated this. He had prepared for it. He took the file, opened it, and began explaining the inconsistencies. But he wasn't about to give her everything at once. Instead, he carefully walked her through the transactions, explaining the technicalities, letting her see the gaps in the data for herself. "I noticed these issues a few weeks ago," David said, his voice steady. "At first, I thought they were just clerical errors, but the more I dug into it, the more I realized that there was a pattern. I didn't act immediately because I wanted to make sure I had all the facts before bringing it up." Laura nodded, her eyes fixed on the documents in front of her. "I appreciate your diligence," she said, "but what exactly are you suggesting? That these payments were made intentionally?" David paused, letting the question hang in the air for a moment. He could see the wheels turning in Laura's mind. She wasn't ready to jump to conclusions yet, but she was getting closer. "I'm suggesting that the approval process was manipulated," David said carefully. "Someone has been bypassing the usual protocols, pushing payments through without proper checks. And it all leads back to the same person, Jason Malone." The silence in the room was thick. Laura didn't immediately respond. She leaned back in her chair, studying David as if trying to determine whether he was telling the truth. He didn't break eye contact. He had said Jason's name, and now there was no going back. "Jason," Laura asked, her voice softer now, "are you sure?" David nodded. "I've documented everything. Every payment, every email, every approval. The system logs don't lie. Jason has been using his position to approve payments to vendors that shouldn't be on the list, authorizing payments to offshore accounts, and making deals that go against company policy." Laura sat in silence for a moment longer before standing up. "This is serious, David. We need to investigate this thoroughly. If what you're saying is true, we have a bigger problem on our hands than just some misplaced invoices." David stood as well, his heart beating faster now that the first domino had fallen. The investigation was starting, and there was no turning back. But David didn't feel fear. He felt calm. He had everything he needed. All he had to do now was let the system take its course. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention," Laura said, her tone shifting back to businesslike. "We'll keep this between us for now. I'll start the investigation immediately." David nodded and turned to leave. As he walked out of Laura's office, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction. He hadn't made a scene. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't even told anyone else. But Jason's empire, built on lies and manipulation, was beginning to crumble. David wasn't angry. He wasn't vengeful. He was just doing what had to be done. And he would stay silent, stay in the background until the truth was undeniable. The next few days were a blur of meetings, whispers, and careful decisions. The office seemed to hum with an uneasy energy, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen, but no one was willing to acknowledge it. Jason still strutted around the office as if nothing had changed, his charm unshaken by the invisible storm that was slowly brewing around him. To David, it was almost surreal. Jason was still the same arrogant, confident manager. Only now, behind his confident facade, he was a man on borrowed time. David continued to work as he always had, maintaining the quiet, unassuming routine that had kept him under the radar for so long. He didn't need to do anything more. The wheels of the investigation were turning now, and all he had to do was wait. There was no need for him to interfere directly, no need to confront Jason. He had already done his part. The truth would speak for itself. But despite his calm exterior, there was a part of David that couldn't help but watch Jason more closely now. Every conversation, every meeting, every email exchange felt like a countdown. Jason had no idea what was coming, but David could see the cracks forming beneath his confident exterior. Jason had made a mistake. He had underestimated David. He had assumed that because David was quiet, he was weak or, worse, invisible. He had no idea that David had been observing, collecting, documenting every mistake, every lie, every betrayal. It was on a Friday afternoon when the next step in the investigation unfolded. David was sitting at his desk, eyes glued to his computer screen, when an unexpected visitor appeared at the doorway. It was Laura, her usual composure slightly shaken. She had been in and out of meetings all week, working with compliance and HR, investigating the evidence David had presented. And now, she was here with an update. "David," she began, stepping into the office, closing the door behind her. "We need to talk." David stood and motioned to the chair across from his desk. "What's going on?" She hesitated for a moment before sitting down. "We've been reviewing the information you provided, and it's worse than we thought." She paused, looking around the office as if ensuring no one was listening. "We've uncovered a significant amount of money that was funneled through fake vendors, offshore accounts, and unauthorized payments. It's a large sum, David, and it's all linked back to Jason." David nodded, his expression unchanged. This wasn't a surprise to him. He had known it would be worse than anyone expected. The complexity of Jason's scheme had only revealed itself piece by piece, but now it was all laid bare. "What happens now?" David asked. Laura leaned forward, her voice low. "We're going to have to act quickly. The auditors are already involved, and HR is preparing for a formal meeting with Jason. But we need to be careful. Jason's been with the company for a long time, and he has powerful connections. This could blow up in a way none of us expect. We can't just fire him immediately. We need a clean, documented process." David understood. This wasn't just about exposing Jason anymore. It was about protecting the company from the fallout of Jason's actions. David had anticipated the need for caution. This wasn't going to be a quick fix, but it was the beginning of the end for Jason's reign. "Is there anything I need to do?" David asked, his voice steady. Laura looked at him for a moment, her gaze assessing. "I need you to keep doing exactly what you're doing. Keep working, keep your head down, don't make waves, let us handle the rest. You've already done your part. The company will take care of the rest." David nodded. He knew his role in this story wasn't over, but for now, it was out of his hands. He couldn't control how things played out. He could only wait and watch as the pieces continued to fall into place. The investigation was moving forward, and soon, Jason would have to answer for his actions. The next week passed uneventfully, but the tension in the office was palpable. Employees spoke in hushed tones, glancing nervously at Jason whenever he passed by, wondering if they were next. Jason, for his part, seemed oblivious to the storm gathering around him. He continued his usual routine, hosting meetings, sending emails, even bragging about the new projects he was leading. But David could see the subtle signs of stress creeping into his demeanor. His smile was tighter, his posture a little more rigid. His confidence was slipping. It was on a Tuesday morning when the final act began to unfold. David was sitting at his desk, sorting through some reports when a message popped up in his inbox. It was from Laura. The subject line was simple: Jason's departure. His heart skipped a beat. He opened the email quickly. "David," the message began, "I wanted to inform you that we've completed our internal investigation into Jason's activities. After reviewing the evidence and consulting with legal, we've decided to part ways with him. His access has been revoked, and he has been informed that his termination is effective immediately." David's eyes lingered on the screen for a moment. Jason was gone. It was over. The email continued. Please continue with your usual work. We will follow up with you shortly to discuss your role moving forward. Thank you for your dedication and patience throughout this process. David sat back in his chair, the weight of the moment settling over him. It wasn't a victory. He hadn't done this for personal gain, but it was justice in its purest form. Jason had taken what wasn't his for too long, and now the truth had finally caught up with him. That afternoon, the office felt different. Jason's absence was felt immediately. People who had once tiptoed around him now spoke freely, their shoulders relaxed, their conversations lighter. It was like the company had exhaled a collective sigh of relief. Jason was gone, but the damage he had caused would take time to undo. David didn't celebrate. He didn't need to. He had done what was right, and that was enough. He went back to his desk and continued his work, just as he had before. But now there was a subtle shift in the way his colleagues looked at him. They saw him for what he truly was, competent, diligent, and steady. No longer the quiet observer, but the one who had helped bring the truth to light. And in the days that followed, as HR sent out the official company-wide memo announcing Jason's termination, David continued to work in the background. He didn't need applause. He didn't need recognition. He had already received the one thing that mattered most, the knowledge that justice had been served. It had been a few weeks since Jason was fired, but the dust was still settling. David had done what needed to be done, and now the office felt like a different place. The tension that had hung over the cubicles and meeting rooms was slowly dissipating, replaced by a new energy. People were talking again. There were no more whispers in hallways, no more sideways glances when Jason's name came up. It was as though a weight had been lifted, though no one spoke about it openly. David, however, felt it more than anyone. The truth had been revealed and justice had been done, but it hadn't been the dramatic, life-changing event people might imagine. There had been no fireworks, no shouting or public confrontations. There had been no vindication. Jason had simply been removed from the equation, and life had gone on. He had done his part, but now, his future at FinTech Solutions remained uncertain. Jason's termination had caused a stir, and HR had already begun making inquiries about David's role in the entire situation. But they didn't know the half of it. They didn't know the full scope of what David had done, how much he had uncovered, or how close they had come to losing far more than just Jason. All David had done was observe, document, and wait. The company had its own systems in place for dealing with corruption, and he had simply allowed it to play out. It wasn't that David had become some kind of whistleblower hero. It was just that, when the time came, he had chosen to act. The evidence was there, and David hadn't shied away from sharing it when it mattered most. But that didn't mean he wanted the spotlight. He didn't want accolades or attention. What he wanted was peace. And that, finally, seemed possible. The next month brought more changes. The company implemented new financial safeguards and compliance measures to prevent anything like what had happened with Jason from ever occurring again. David wasn't involved in those discussions. He didn't need to be. His work had been done. But he was aware of the subtle changes happening around him. People were more open with one another. The culture of secrecy that had allowed Jason to flourish was being dismantled piece by piece. There were more meetings about accountability, more conversations about transparency, more efforts to rebuild trust. David wasn't asked to lead any of those initiatives. He didn't want to be asked. He didn't want to be a hero, and he didn't want to be known for what he had done. He just wanted to do his job, quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention. He wanted to prove, in his own way, that quiet power, steadiness, reliability, consistency, was just as effective as the loud, flashy authority that people like Jason had wielded. As the weeks turned into months, David started to notice something subtle. The people around him, the ones who had once ignored him or underestimated his potential, were starting to acknowledge him in small ways. A nod of approval from a colleague when he solved a problem no one else could. A quiet thank you from a manager when his data helped make a decision easier. It wasn't much, but it was enough. David wasn't looking for gratitude, but he couldn't help but notice that the way people viewed him had changed. He wasn't just another cog in the machine anymore. He was someone they could rely on. One afternoon, as David sat at his desk, reviewing a new batch of reports, he received an unexpected email from Laura Bishop. She had been a constant presence since the investigation, and David had kept in touch with her intermittently as the process moved forward. The email was simple, just a subject line that read, "Meeting request, future role discussion." David frowned. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he opened it immediately. "David, I'd like to sit down with you and discuss some opportunities moving forward. We've been reviewing your performance over the past few months, and we think it's time for a conversation about your future here. Please come by my office when you have a chance." David's heart skipped a beat. This could be the moment, the one that determined whether he would be just another overlooked employee or something more. But as always, he maintained his composure. He was ready for whatever came next. He had made peace with the idea that his job could be anything from a promotion to a simple acknowledgement of his efforts. But it didn't matter. He would continue to do his job, quietly and efficiently, just as he always had. The meeting with Laura was scheduled for the next day. When David arrived at her office, she greeted him with a warm smile and gestured for him to sit. "I won't take up too much of your time, David," she began. "I just wanted to thank you personally for everything you've done over the past few months. I know it wasn't easy, and I know you've worked behind the scenes to ensure the company's success, even when it wasn't recognized." David nodded but said nothing. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate her words, he just didn't know how to respond. He had never done what he did for recognition, and he wasn't about to start now. "I also wanted to let you know that after reviewing your work, we've decided to offer you a new role," Laura continued, her tone changing slightly. "We believe you're ready for more responsibility, more of a leadership position. You've demonstrated tremendous skill in navigating difficult situations, and we think you could help guide the company as we continue to rebuild." David blinked, surprised but not entirely shocked. He had always known he was good at his job, but to hear it from someone else, someone who had seen firsthand what he was capable of, felt different. It was a recognition he hadn't expected, and yet it made sense. He had always believed that quiet consistency was more valuable than loud ambition. Laura leaned forward, smiling. "Of course, we'd love to have you take on a more prominent role, but we're also very mindful of what you've already contributed. So we'd like to make sure that you feel comfortable with the new responsibilities before anything is finalized. Take some time to think about it, and let me know your decision." David nodded, processing the information. He had always imagined himself in a leadership role, but he hadn't thought it would happen this way. And now, the idea of taking on more responsibility didn't seem daunting. It felt natural. "Thank you, Laura," David said, his voice steady. "I'll take some time to think it over." As he left her office, David felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He hadn't sought out a promotion. He hadn't demanded recognition. He had simply done his job, and in the end, it had worked out for him. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room. He wasn't the one who sought attention. But his consistency, his reliability, had earned him the respect he deserved. The company was moving forward, and so was he. Jason's departure had changed everything, but it had also confirmed what David had always known. Real power didn't come from arrogance or manipulation. It came from the truth. It came from the quiet confidence that you could stand by your work, day after day, no matter what. And now, David was ready for the next chapter.